Well, good morning. I hope everyone is well, whether it's morning that you're joining me here or able to record after the fact. But my name is Jamie Forbes, and for almost the past 20 years, my career in finance has been about helping professional investors put their money to good use. So I am very excited to be with you today in this business and finance stream to explore with me some key principles of investing that reflect God's heart for our world. Now, obviously, we know that the Bible has a lot to teach us on issues of justice, equity, fairness, and speaking up for the most vulnerable in our world. As Christians, what are ways that we can integrate these principles in how we invest? So, for example, what does being responsible stewards of the resources we've been given look like when it comes to issues like climate change? So we'll spend about 30 minutes or so unpacking this, and I'd love to leave some time for Q&A if anyone has any. So first, I want to offer that we all have a calling to invest the resources we've been given. Jesus tells us the story of the parable of talents in Matthew 25, where the master gives his servants talents of money or bags of gold. So one servant gets 5 bags, another gets 2, and another gets 1. And Jesus says these are each according to their ability. So those that got the most, the 5 bags and 2, put their money to work and managed to double it. But the man who received 1 digs a hole in the ground and hides his master's money. When the master returned, he was pleased with the first 2. Why would you not? Doubled their money. He praised them, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servants. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." But when the man who had been given 1 told his master that he had hid the money in the ground, but he gave it back to him, the master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant. You should have at least put my money on deposit with bankers so that I would have received it back with interest." He then gave that bag of money to the man who already had 10 and threw the worthless servant outside. My study Bible says the point of that parable is that being ready for Christ's coming involves more than playing it safe and doing little or nothing. It demands the kind of service that produces results. So I want to offer for us today that in making decisions about investments, that we are to reflect the loving, generous, and just nature of God, and to be holy and merciful and perfect as he is. It's a tall order. But I also want to offer that a core part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to look after our world in all the different forms that that takes. About 5 years ago, I stumbled upon the Church of England's climate change policy for something I was researching for work. You may or may not know that exists, but this paper outlines the theological basis for how the church manages their investments, taking specifically climate change into consideration. And I found that for the first time in my over 30 years of being raised in the church, albeit a very American evangelical expression of it, I was moved to tears, really seeing the clear heart of God making plain his divinely mandated responsibility for humankind to steward the resources of our physical world, not only for one another and its creatures, but especially the weakest and the least. And this mandate, it brings the kingdom of heaven into greater realization on earth. Now, I'll give full disclosure, that paper is what I've sourced pretty heavily for this talk. So please do have a look at it if you want to learn more. It's a pretty great read. So in our session today, I'm going to outline how integrating climate change considerations and the related issues of justice, protecting the poor and vulnerable, and loving our neighbor, how those can be integrated into our investments, and how that reflects the nature of God and the kind of service that produces results in being ready for Christ's coming. And then finally, I will offer some practical concepts that you can use today in your own personal or more professional investments. So firstly, let's maybe take a look at a science lesson. So what is climate change, and some implications on our world? A few years ago, I was invited to attend a talk in the city, and it was being given by a petite, very slightly spunky, but incredibly articulate Canadian woman called Catherine Hayhoe. And Catherine is an atmospheric scientist and professor of political science from Texas Tech University, where she directs the Climate Science Center. And her TED Talk, which I'd highly recommend, very engaging, has received nearly 3 million views. And she's currently writing a book on how to talk about climate change that will be released sometime this year. And Catherine also grew up the daughter of missionaries and is an outspoken Christian about her faith, and is often asked to speak where these two aspects of her life intersect. So I remember in her talk, her saying, "As a Christian living in Texas, I often get asked about why I believe in climate change. And I have to explain why climate change is not a belief system." She says, "We know that the Earth's climate is changing, thanks to the observations, facts, and data about God's creation that we can see with our eyes and test with the sound minds that God has given us." So I'll just give us some examples of these observations, facts, and data. Probably the landmark report published in 2013 by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for the first time, really drew the line that human activity, particularly through the emissions of carbon dioxide, is the dominant cause of climate change. And that if emissions continue to rise at the current rate, that by the end of this century, so only about 80 years from now, the average global temperature is likely to be 2.5 to 5 degrees Celsius higher than at present. And we're already starting to see the impacts of these higher temperatures on our hydrological and biological systems. And obviously, as the average global temperature increases, we're more likely to see heat waves occurring with a higher frequency and duration. And clearly, we've already seen some of that. And as climate change continues to accelerate, experts warn that extreme weather events, from hurricanes to floods and wildfires, are likely to become more common. And the human impacts are predicted to include, loss of life, loss of livelihoods, and that impact extends beyond the human impact, and of course affects the ecological well-being of our planet. So just a few examples of those, in low-lying coastal zones and small island developing states, we're likely to see death, injury, ill health, and disrupted livelihoods as storm surges, coastal flooding, and sea levels rise. During periods of extreme heat, particularly for very vulnerable urban populations, as well as those working outdoors, we should expect increased rates of mortality and disease. And as a result of warming, drought, flooding, and precipitation extremes, food insecurity and the breakdown of food systems are likely, particularly for poor populations. And then for subsistence farmers with minimal capital in drier rural regions, they face loss of livelihoods due to insufficient access to drinking water and irrigation, and reduced productivity of their agricultural. So, we've already started to hear some of these situations and some of these populations described as climate refugees. And you probably heard this thread, that here's the particularly unfair part, that these impacts of climate change are likely to be particularly severe for those populations and communities in the weakest economic position. Also unfair, it is the poorest that have contributed the least to these greenhouse gas emissions and who are least able to adapt to the climate-related extremes, and yet they suffer disproportionately the ecological, social, and economic consequences that flow from these changes. And these populations of both low-income countries as well as those living in poverty in middle and high-income countries, these populations are most in need of strategies that enable economic and sustainable growth. And that economic growth has historically come with a need for increased access to energy, and it's difficult to imagine that happening without an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, at least for a few years. So here's the rub. Why would lower income countries even support international greenhouse gas emission reduction measures by agreeing to constrain or reduce their own emissions when they're not primarily to blame for the situation we're in, and their economic development is closely linked to increasing their own access to energy? It's likely to come with an increase in emissions. So in addition to the ecological considerations for biodiversity and the impact on livelihoods and human life that causes, it's really an issue about justice that calls for urgent global action and ensuring equitable access to enriching and sustainable development as we transition, hopefully rapidly, to a more low carbon economy. So now if we think about, well, what is the biblical and theological perspective on climate change? We've seen what science tells us is the direction of travel. So what are we as Christians maybe to do with that information? So I want to introduce us to the work of A. Rocha, a nonprofit Christian conservationist group that sponsored this talk that I went to with Catherine. And funnily enough, my husband mentioned to me that they are also a leading resource that he uses in his job teaching religious studies for secondary school in Southwest London when they cover the ethics and environment topic. So it's always fun when our worlds can collide. But what drives A. Rocha's work is the belief that a core part of being a follower of Jesus is to look after our world. So why do they say that? Well, number one, probably an obvious one, God made the world and he loves it. We see in Genesis, he calls it very good. We see in the Psalms and in Matthew when Jesus likens or talks about the Father's care for even the sparrows, that God is involved with his creation. He sustains it and cares for it. And in Colossians, we're told that in Christ, all things have been created through him and from him. And in him, all things hold together. So if God loves the world, then we want to love what he loves and to take care of it for his sake. And secondly, God created us to look after it. We are created human beings, part of the whole community of creation. And we've been given a special task to look after what God has made, the physical world, its creatures, and one another. And one key point I think maybe bears repeating is that this is not an optional extra for a few keen green environmentalists. This is a fundamental part of what it means to be human and a follower of Christ. And thirdly, it's gone wrong because of us. It is a sad truth that human activity has caused the climate change and the warming of our planet, and many problems our world faces caused by human activity. And perhaps it's not surprising that the dominion over creation we were given by God has often become domination, in which our greed and selfishness have exploited the earth, its produce and its creatures for our own ends, rather than the glory of God and the good of his world. As prophesied in the Old Testament, our acts of human sin have consequences on our planet, on our ecology. And the history of the human race, the earliest maybe example or story in the Tower of Babel in Genesis, also warns us to beware our human pride and our confidence that we can do anything. And it calls for proper humility in the face of challenges like climate change. But I want to leave us some hope as well that God has a purpose for us, and a purpose for when things go wrong. And his reaction is not to give up and destroy the world, but to call into being a people to serve him in caring for his world. First, through the story of Noah, then the history of the call of Israel as God's people, and eventually in the incarnation of Jesus Christ as God's ultimate plan for salvation. Colossians again tells us that God was reconciling everything under creation to himself through Christ. And Paul tells us in the letter to Corinthians that this is a task he has passed on to us. God has promised that when Jesus returns, this world will be radically renewed, that the physical world is destined not for the destruction of global warming or the doom of heat death among the stars, but for a new heaven and new earth, where the relationship between God and human beings, his creation and his creatures, will be perfected. This is our ultimate Christian hope. But in the meantime, we live between the times in this current age where we are called to continue God's reconciling work among his people. And Paul uses the image of creation groaning in labor pains as it is waiting in eager longing for that consummation. And Paul also stresses the urgency of the need for action. He says in Romans, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep. Therefore, we must do all we can to mitigate whatever is damaging God's creation and his creatures, and to promote all that is good and brings his kingdom nearer. In particular, our response to commands to show mercy and love our neighbor as ourselves must recognize that our neighbor may be from a different race, religion, or part of the world. And such neighbors, and as Jesus calls the least of these, must not only be intra-generational with regard for not only the poor who are always with us, but also intergenerational with regard for those of future generations whose very existence, livelihood, health may be damaged or precluded by our actions at this critical time. And Catherine goes on to say, being concerned about climate change is a genuine expression of our faith, bringing our attitudes and actions more closely into line with who we already are and what we most want to be. The Church of England says, as Christians, we accept the scientific consensus that greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are the most significant contributor to climate change in the world. And urgent action is needed if we are to avert the worst consequences of climate change on our ecosystems and on present and future generations. Well, I don't know about you, but that leaves me wanting desperately to know, what can we do? What can be done? So I'll kind of outline a couple of things for us. One, the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have said that to prevent the most severe impacts of climate change, the most important thing is to agree a target of keeping this temperature rise on average to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. And that's a rise since pre-industrial times. Now, to give us a sense, we're already at just under 1 degree Celsius. So it's not leaving a lot left in the budget, so to speak. And this group of scientists have estimated that if we do nothing, it puts us between, if you remember, about a rise of, or on track for a rise of about 2.5 to 5 degrees in only really what's 2 to 3 generations. If I think about that very much affecting my grandchildren and likely yours as well as I mentioned, a lot of the impacts going on in our world already today. Now, there was a pretty significant agreement between most of the world's governments in the United Nations Climate Change Conference in December 2015. It's been known as the Paris Agreement, that really ratified and made commitments to that target of no more than 2 degrees Celsius. And the IPCC estimates that if we're to hit and to meet that target, that will require a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced by 40 to 70% by 2050. And that's kind of the percent change relative to 10 years ago. And that will require our energy supply to become really fully decarbonized by the end of this century. Now, delays to that, if we are slow to move, that will simply make the cost of transitioning that much higher. And unfortunately, the long-term economic impacts are much more significant. And the church in their climate change policy has said keeping that global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius is only part of what we as investors need to do to protect the endangered ecosystems and address the needs of the world's poor, who again are particularly vulnerable to climate change and disasters. But also from an ethical perspective, a key focus in relation to climate change should also be on assisting the just transition to a low carbon economy. And that means ensuring that entire communities and livelihoods aren't left behind in that transition. So as individuals, we each have a personal responsibility to live more sustainable and equitable lives and to challenge ourselves about our own patterns of perhaps selfish patterns of consumption, our direct and indirect use of fossil fuels, and hopefully recognizing the level of solidarity with and support for others, particularly the poorest and weakest. Catherine wrote in an article I found last year in the New York Times, which is pretty bold to be saying in such a publication, that climate change will strike hard against the very people we are told to care for and love, will amplify hunger and poverty, and increase risks of resource scarcity that can exacerbate political instability and even create or worsen refugee crises. And then there's pollution, biodiversity loss, habitat fragmentation, species extinction. Climate change makes all those worse too. In fact, if we truly believe that we've been given responsibility for every living thing on this planet, including each other, as it says in Genesis 1, then it isn't only a matter of caring about climate change. We should be at the front of the line demanding action. And that brings us to some final comments about what are some practical things that we as investors can do. Well, first thing that I would suggest is to start with measuring or asking the managers that maybe look after investments for you to measure the carbon footprint. So that's the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions on your investments. So that's going to be an aggregate of the carbon footprint of all of the companies that you might be invested in. So if you start with that baseline of understanding what the current carbon footprint is of the companies that you're invested in, you can start to seek to find ways to reduce those. One is by looking at those that might be worst offenders and seeing if there might be some options to disinvest from some companies in favor of more sustainable ones, or companies with smaller carbon footprint, but also challenging those companies to find out, are they setting targets? Are they making themselves accountable to reducing? There's a lot of great work being done by global groups to encourage consistency in how these companies can be reporting their emissions, as well as really pushing for action in how they might go about reducing and being held accountable to emission reductions. And certainly we see in the UK a push towards a world in which we're moving towards a net zero. So the emissions that you are emitting are outweighed by those that you're saving, so that it's neutralizing that impact. So number one, start with looking at carbon footprint, measuring it, and seeking ways to reduce it, either in your own investments or through the companies that you might be invested in. Secondly, this has to do with thinking about how you can start to transition investments from one company to another. And one that I wanted to just highlight is that this is not likely to be only affecting those companies that are high carbon emitters. This is not just an issue of gas and oil companies or the energy sector. The CEO of the largest asset manager in the world just said, I think last week I saw this quote, that there is no company whose business model won't be profoundly affected by the transition to a low carbon economy. So as investors, we can look for investment strategies that are based on very sound principles of diversification and other key principles, and that can look to systematically redirect your capital or your investment away from those companies that are less sustainable and towards those who are contributing to or stand to benefit from this transition to a low carbon economy. So just maybe an example of that is car manufacturers who might be further behind in developing electric vehicles. Well, they will struggle to capture growing demand, especially as countries like the UK have mandated that we stop selling diesel or petrol cars in only 10 years' time. And so you may want to redirect investment to those companies who are making it a strategic priority and an effort of their businesses to invest in electric vehicles, and to who are more at the leading edge there, and who are going to benefit from that transition, and indeed who are a driving force behind it. Now, I want to maybe issue a slight word of caution that sometimes as we start to think about these concepts, it's easy to go down the path of just excluding anything that's quote unquote bad. There used to be the idea in the early days of what was called socially responsible investing, that companies involved in sin sectors like tobacco or pornography or alcohol, you just excluded those out of your portfolio. Now, that might be something that doesn't affect your financial outcome that much if it's just a handful of securities or stocks and they don't make up that much of an impact in the overall portfolio. But when it comes to something like carbon emissions, remember that quote, that there's no company really in the world that will not be impacted by this. It's if you simply didn't invest in those most highly emitting companies, well, then you start to exclude entire sectors. And actually, if you think about maybe in the energy sector in particular, what about those companies that are leading the way in investing in renewable energy technology? I think BP and Shell in particular are relatively good examples of that within their sector. So if you kind of write off the whole sector as being, the most carbon intensive, well, then you run the risk of, I guess, in a sense, cutting off your nose to spite your face, that you remove investment from those companies who are actually very well placed to lead the charge in areas of renewable technologies and renewable energy. So helpful to just keep in mind that balance of not necessarily exclusion, but also the concept of engaging. And as investors in companies, as we might own shares in them, or through some of the pooled funds that you might invest in, well, then you have access to engage with those companies and those that are significant contributors to gas emissions, such as the fossil fuel producers or the electricity generating utilities, large energy users, the materials and steel sector, for example, are significant producers of energy intensive products. Well, you have access to engage with those companies to encourage them to assist in this transition to a low carbon economy. And again, hold them accountable to setting targets to reduce their emissions and ultimately make their businesses more sustainable. I'll just give an example. For the assets that the Church of England manages, engagement for them also includes advocating for appropriate protection for the natural environment, making sure that mining companies have appropriate safeguards in place to protect the environment that they work in, and also that they're advocating for just and affordable access to energy for the poor. If you recall some of the challenges we talked about at the beginning. Now, I will kind of caveat this balance of exclusion and engagement with the fact that, well, for some fossil fuel companies, particularly those associated with the activities of the highest carbon emissions, so that's extraction of coal and things called oil sands. Now, those are the activities from which there is a case to be made that there is a critical need to disinvest straight away, because those are the companies with whom there is the least scope for productive engagement. If that's the core of what they do, they're not going to change their business model, and so perhaps best to redirect your investment elsewhere. And finally, I will maybe offer that it's not just important how companies, that it's not just important what companies do, but how they behave. And often this is called a concept called ESG investing, which you might have heard of before. It stands for environmental, social, and governance practices. So that concept is that you would consider the environmental, social, and governance practices of companies that you invest in, or maybe the managers that do that for you. Things like, how are they managing environmental risks in their supply chain? You might have seen a news article earlier this year about the clothing manufacturer or the clothing shop Boohoo really getting criticized for the labor practices in some of their factories. So are there appropriate safeguards in place for employees? Are they being treated and compensated fairly? And thinking back to climate change, as companies are redirecting some of their activities towards less carbon intensive areas of their business, well, what about employees that are no longer a part of the core aspect of those companies? How are those employees being supported in that transition? Are these companies contributing to a just transition? Are they offering support? Are they offering retraining? Are they offering redeployment? How are they promoting investment in the communities that they operate in? So those are the types of E, S, and G practices to consider how companies are behaving. One example I saw last week that I thought was a good one is Unilever announced that by 2030, they will only deal with suppliers who pay a living wage or income. And, you know, obviously in a lot of the developing economies that Unilever would be sourcing from, that can be really significant to those communities. So I will leave us maybe with this. I came across this definition of ESG in the Financial Times just earlier this week, and I thought this might be a nice way to close our discussion. But the core of ESG is the idea that investors should weigh factors such as climate change or diversity when considering investment assets, with the aim of improving corporate behavior and potentially even improving returns. So thank you very much for joining us today. Again, I hope that you've had a fantastic conference, and if you do have any other further questions, please do get in touch. Thanks very much.